Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into something really legendary based on the great sources you sent us. The world's 7 great wonders.
Yeah, we've got quite a stack here. Articles, research notes, all about these amazing ancient structures.
Right. And our mission today is to unpack all this, pull out the key info, maybe find some surprising facts, and just get a really solid perspective on these marvels.
Definitely. We'll touch on the Great Pyramid, obviously, you kind of have to.
Of course.
But we'll mostly be focusing on the other six, looking into the mysteries, how they were built.
And maybe dig up some unexpected details, perhaps even a few slightly amusing ones along the way.
Sounds like a plan. It's a list that feels almost, mythical. Everyone's heard of it, but digging into your sources really shows how much we don't know or misunderstand about most of them.
Yeah, exactly. Even where the list itself came from.
Uh-huh.
So let's start right there. Who actually decided these 7 were the ones to see?
Okay, so according to the sources, the list seems to trace back to Philo of Byzantium. He was around maybe 2200, 2300 years ago.
Philo of Byzantium. And he was.
Described as a mechanical researcher, a writer, and importantly, a traveler, they even called him Mechanical Philo.
Mechanical Philo. I like that. Sounds like someone who'd appreciate how things are put together.
Yeah.
Did he travel the whole world then?
Well, not globally like we think of it. The sources suggest his travels were more regional, around the Mediterranean mostly. Didn't get out to, say, Asia, but he wrote about what he saw.
In a book. Did he call it the 7 Great Wonders?
That's where it gets interesting. The sources say his original title was probably something closer to World's Great Things to See.
Huh. Less grand, maybe.
Yeah, more like a practical travel guide. It listed 7 amazing man-made structures he thought were just incredible, worth seeing.
So the Wonders label came later. People were just that impressed.
That seems to be it. Reading his descriptions, the scale, the cleverness later generations likely felt, yeah, these are wonders. Sadly, the original book itself is lost.
Oh, really? Yeah, we only know about it because other ancient writers mentioned it or quoted parts of it.
Wow, a lost guidebook to the ancient world. So, based on those later accounts, what were the 7 things on his list?
Right, your sources list them as the Pyramids of Giza, specifically the Great Pyramid,
Okay, the big one.
then the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the statue of Zeus at Olympia,
Mm-hmm.
the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and finally, the Lighthouse of Alexandria.
That's quite the list. And they weren't all built at the same time, right? You mentioned a big time gap.
Absolutely. The sources really stress this. The Great Pyramid is way, way older, like thousands of years older than Philo himself.
Right.
The other 6 are much younger, built in the centuries leading up to and during Philo's lifetime. The Lighthouse of Alexandria was the newest one on the list.
Okay, that context helps. Now, the big question, were these all actually real? Or just, exaggerated stories travelers told? It's a crucial question. And the sources give pretty strong reasons to believe most of them were very real.
Okay, lay it on us. Why should we believe?
Well, first off, it wasn't just Philo. Other ancient writers mention these places too. Having multiple sources helps.
Right, ancient fact-checking. Makes sense.
Exactly. Second, 6 of the 7 were actually standing during Philo's lifetime.
Ah, so he could have seen them.
Potentially, yes. We don't know for sure if he visited every single one, but it was possible. So his descriptions were likely based on seeing them himself, or at least getting reliable reports from people who had. He wasn't just writing about ancient history.
Good point. Not describing ruins from 1,000 years before.
Right. And the third reason, probably the most convincing, is the archaeology. Especially over the last century or so, archaeologists have found actual physical evidence for 4 of those other 6 wonders.
Tangible proof, like ruins and stuff.
Exactly. Ruins, artifacts, even workshops where things were made. Stuff that proves they existed, even when people used to doubt it.
So most are confirmed real then? Any exceptions?
Most, yes. But there's one really big nagging mystery on the list. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon.
Ah, yeah. That one always sounds the most like a fairy tale. What's the issue there?
This is where it gets really puzzling. Archaeologists have dug up the ruins of ancient Babylon. It's a known site, but they've never found any definitive trace of these massive gardens.
Nothing at all.
Nothing concrete. And what's maybe even weirder is they found thousands of clay tablets from Babylon detailing city life, buildings, big events, and not one mentions the Hanging Gardens.
Wow. Not a single mention in their own records.
Oh.
For something supposedly so spectacular, it feels off.
It really does. That lack of local evidence makes some sources wonder if the gardens were maybe entirely legendary, or perhaps a highly romanticized story told by outsiders.
What about the name Hanging Gardens? Does that mean anything?
Well, it probably means overhanging or terraced, like built up in the air on platforms, which makes sense for the description, but it doesn't explain why there's no trace on the ground. It's still the biggest question mark.
Okay, so the Hanging Gardens could be real, could be myth. Let's dive into what the old accounts say it was like, and then hit the others we have more proof for. So, Babylon's gardens, if they existed.
If they existed, descriptions paint an amazing picture. They're linked to King Nebuchadnezzar II from the New Babylonian dynasty, maybe 2,600 years ago. And this is Babylon, a city with history stretching way, way back in Mesopotamia.
Right. And wasn't there a kind of sweet romantic story about why he built them?
Yes. This is a nice human touch from the sources. The story goes he built them for his wife, who was a princess from Media, a mountainous green place.
Unlike Babylon.
Exactly. Babylon was flat and dry. She apparently missed the hills and forests of her homeland, so Nebuchadnezzar supposedly built this huge tiered garden to look like a green mountain, just to ease her homesickness.
Ah, a giant monument built out of love. So what did this artificial mountain look like?
Descriptions talk about rising platforms or terraces, kind of like a stepped pyramid or a huge amphitheater. Estimates vary, but maybe 20 meters high,
Yeah.
like 7 or 8 stories. And a big square base, maybe 120 meters aside. Think like a football field. All held up by columns and arches filled with exotic plants, trees, waterfalls.
Okay, hold on. Building something that big, multi-level, holding tons of wet soil and trees? How did they do that with mud bricks? Didn't Babylon lack stone?
That's one of the huge construction mysteries the sources bring up. They mostly had alluvial mud, so yeah, mud bricks. Building that high and heavy without modern cement or steel reinforcement, it's baffling.
But that wasn't even the biggest problem, was it?
No. The biggest mystery, the one everyone debates, is the irrigation. How do they get water from the Euphrates River constantly pumped up 20 meters high to keep everything alive?
Yeah, how did they do that? Non-stop water, 7 stories up in ancient times.
That's the million-dollar question. Things like the Archimedes screw, which could lift water well, came later. The sources mention speculation, maybe people hauling buckets by hand in long chains. Or some kind of unknown pump or crane.
Seems incredibly labor-intensive, though, for that volume of water, continuously.
It seems almost impossible with the tech we know they had. Keeping a massive garden lush in a desert climate that high up, it's a huge challenge. It definitely fuels the doubt about whether it was real, or at least as grand as described.
It really makes you wonder what ancient engineers were capable of that we just don't understand. Okay, let's leave the maybe mythical gardens and go to something definitely real, but equally stunning, the statue of Zeus at Olympia.
Right, this one was inside the main temple of Zeus at Olympia, where the ancient Olympics were held.
And it wasn't just some statue.
No way, it was massive, about 14 meters high, maybe 4 stories tall, and it was designed to be seen indoors, filling the temple space.
Impressive. What was it made of? Not just stone, right?
That's the amazing part. Not stone, not even bronze. The skin was ivory, and the robes, crown, staff, all that was gold, built over a wooden frame, and the throne he sat on, ebony, ivory, gold, gems. Unbelievably lavish.
Ivory and gold on that scale must have been absolutely breathtaking and expensive.
Totally. It was considered like the absolute peak of Greek sculpture and craftsmanship at the time. Hugely influential later on.
I think I read something kind of funny about its size in the sources.
Yeah. The old criticism that if Zeus actually stood up, his head would go right through the temple roof.
Huh. An all-powerful god trapped by the ceiling.
Exactly. But, the artistic argument, according to the sources, was that having him seated, but so huge that he dominated the entire space, created this incredible sense of divine presence. More powerful than if he was standing, but smaller.
Makes sense. Who was the artist behind this masterpiece?
A super famous Greek sculptor named Phidias. And your sources have a great little story about him.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently, he'd just finished a giant statue of Athena in Athens. But then he got accused of pocketing some of the gold meant for it.
A scandal.
Yeah. He ended up getting exiled from Athens because of it. And then Olympia invited him to come make their Zeus statue.
Wow. Talk about bouncing back.
Yeah.
So like the gardens, this statue is gone now. Did people doubt it existed too?
For a long time, yes. Especially the idea of making such a huge figure out of ivory sheets. How did they do that? And with no remains for centuries, it was easy to doubt. But then came the 1950s.
What happened? Archaeology strikes again.
You got it. They were excavating near the temple ruins and found Phidias's actual workshop.
No way. His workshop.
Yes. Complete with tools, terracotta molds used for shaping parts, even scraps of ivory and other materials. It was definitive proof the statue was real, and it showed how it was likely made.
That's incredible. Finding the artist's studio. Did they figure out the ivory technique?
Well, this is where it gets fascinating and a bit mysterious again. The workshop finds suggest Phidias cut the ivory into thin sheets. Then, and this is the part we don't fully understand, he somehow softened them, maybe using vinegar, that's one theory, then shaped them in the molds and fitted them onto the wooden core.
Softening ivory sheets.
Yeah, it seems to have been his unique technique, a lost art now. The sources make a good point. Maybe our inability to figure out exactly how he did it just shows the limits of our knowledge today, not that it was impossible back then.
That's a really humbling thought. Maybe we've lost skills. So how did this amazing statue finally meet its end?
It lasted less than 1,000 years. When the Roman Empire became Christian, they started closing pagan temples. The Temple of Zeus was sealed up.
Right.
But then one emperor apparently appreciated its artistry and had it moved to a palace in Constantinople.
Saved it, sort of.
For a while. And here's another funny bit from the sources. This emperor supposedly even considered having Zeus's head removed and replaced with a portrait of himself.
Oh, come on. The ego.
Right. Luckily, that didn't happen. But sadly, the statue was ultimately destroyed in a massive fire in Constantinople around 462 CE.
What a loss. Okay, next up on the list, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus.
Right. This was in Ephesus, a really wealthy Greek city, now in Turkey. Unlike Zeus, there are some remains here, scattered stones, one column they've put back up.
And what did it look like originally?
Sources describe a massive, pure white marble temple. Huge dimensions, 137 meters long, 69 wide, 18 high, over 120 giant columns. And apparently, the column bases were unique, carved with life-sized figures of gods, really ornate.
Dedicated to Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon. The sources link her name to the NASA moon missions, right?
Yeah, they make that connection. Now, the origin story for the very first temple on this site, according to some myths in your sources, involves, well, the Amazons.
Wait, the legendary warrior women? They built a temple.
According to some ancient myths cited, yes. The legend describes them as this tribe of fierce women warriors near the Black Sea. They supposedly only interacted with men to reproduce, kept the baby girls to raise as warriors, and, well, the myths say they killed the baby boys.
Whoa. Okay, killing the baby boys. That's pretty intense for an origin story. Makes the whole female training school idea sound quite grim.
It definitely adds a dark edge to the legend. Anyway, they supposedly worshipped Artemis, the huntress goddess. That mythical first temple was said to be destroyed by a flood.
Okay, so myth aside, who built the one that made the wonders list?
That one was rebuilt by the kingdom of Lydia, which was incredibly rich. Their king Croesus was so wealthy, it became an idiom, richer than Croesus.
Ah, right. Where did they get all that money?
Partly from panning gold in the Pactolus River. They're also credited with inventing the first proper minted coins, gold and silver ones.
The invention of coinage. No wonder they could afford a wonder.
Pretty much. Croesus hired the best architects. It took a long time to build, estimates range, but maybe 50 years is a common figure. It's also where the sculptor Scotus first got famous. We'll hear his name again.
A 50-year project.
Yeah.
So how did this famous temple finally end? More earthquakes.
This one has a stranger story. The temple Croesus funded was deliberately burned down in 356 BCE by a guy named Herostratus.
Burnt down. Why?
His stated reason, he just wanted to be famous. He figured destroying something so beautiful and renowned would make his name live forever.
Destroying a wonder just for notoriety, that's incredibly messed up, but kind of darkly funny in a pathetic way. Did it work?
Well, we're still talking about him, so maybe. But the locals were furious and actually passed a law forbidding anyone from even saying his name. Didn't stick, obviously. But they rebuilt the temple again. And that version, the third one, is the one on Philo's list.
Wow. Third time's the charm.
Apparently. It was filled with art, but suffered more fires over time. The final destruction came from invading Goths in 260 CE, leaving it in ruins.
What a cycle of destruction and rebuilding.
Yeah.
Okay, next. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus. Another one in Turkey?
Yep. Halicarnassus, modern Turkey. And this one was basically a gigantic, super fancy tomb. Some ruins still exist for this one, too.
How gigantic are we talking?
Pretty huge, about 43 meters high, maybe 14 stories. And the base was about 32 by 38 meters. Outside of the pyramids, it was the biggest above-ground tomb known in that part of the world.
Who was important enough to get a tomb like that?
It was for Mausolus. He was technically a governor for the Persian Empire, but he ruled his area like a king. And it was also for his wife, who was also his sister, Artemisia.
Wife and sister. Okay. Different times.
Indeed. Mausolus actually started planning and building it while he was still alive around 350 BCE. He hired top talent, including that sculptor Scopas we mentioned from the Artemis Temple. It took about 27 years total.
And the style, was it unique?
Sources say it was kind of a blend. It had columns like the Temple of Artemis, a pyramid-shaped roof, and a big statue group on top. Mausolus and Artemisia riding a chariot. The stone base alone was massive, like 12,000 tons. Walls covered in carvings, statues, very elaborate.
Did Mausolus live to see it finished?
Nope, he died before it was done. His wife's sister Artemisia took over ruling and was determined to finish his grand tomb.
Ah, she wanted to complete his legacy.
Yeah, but then she died only 2 years later, and it still wasn't quite finished. Their successor finally wrapped it up and put both their bodies inside.
Quite the saga. How long did this massive tomb last?
It was really durable, stood for over 1,700 years, survived minor quakes and stuff. What finally got it was a big earthquake in 1402 CE.
Another earthquake victim. What happened to the stones?
After it collapsed, locals reused them for other buildings, even a nearby castle or fort. Practical recycling.
Any mysteries about what was inside? You mentioned bodies and treasure?
Yeah, there's a curious story in the sources. Apparently, after the earthquake brought it down, some invaders, Knights of St. John, maybe broke into the tomb chamber, likely hoping for treasure, but they decided to wait until the next day to fully explore or loot it when they came back.
Let me guess.
Empty.
Completely empty.
Yeah.
Treasure, bodies, everything gone. Vanished overnight. Nobody knows who took them or where they went.
Another ancient mystery disappearance. And our word mausoleum comes from this guy, Mausolus, right?
Exactly. His tomb was so over-the-top grand, his name became the generic term for any large, fancy tomb. And the sources again mention that Freemason Memorial in D.C., saying it seems to echo the mausoleum's design too, with those sphinxes hinting at ancient links.
Interesting connection. Okay, 2 left. The Colossus of Rhodes. Didn't we mention this one before briefly? Yeah, you're right. Your sources noted a connection when we talked about the Antikythera mechanism. The Colossus was that giant bronze statue at the harbor entrance on the Greek island of Rhodes.
Giant is right. How tall was it?
The statue itself was about 33 meters, standing on pedestals maybe 15 meters high. So altogether, around 48 meters, roughly 15 stories tall. It was the biggest bronze statue of its time, built around 280 BCE.
Why did they build such a huge statue? Who was it of?
It was their patron god, Helios, the sun god. They built it to celebrate winning a major siege against invaders. And symbolically, they actually used bronze melted down from the enemy's leftover siege equipment to make it.
Turning swords into statues.
Oh,
Nice. Rhodes must have been good with bronze.
Very. The sources say Rhodes was a real hub for mechanics and bronze casting. They made lots of smaller statues they exported. The Colossus was like their ultimate showpiece, proving their skill.
Wasn't there some crazy legend about it having moving parts? Think about pouring molten iron.
Oh, yeah. The sources mention that fun, wild legend, the idea that it could move its hand, and in the really extreme versions, pour molten metal onto enemy ships trying to sail past it.
Huh. A defensive wonder. Probably not true, but a great image. Putting that aside, just building a bronze statue that tall, standing up?
How do they keep it stable?
That's a huge engineering question. It stood upright on 2 legs, unlike the seated Zeus. It's a major mystery how they balanced the weight and dealt with wind forces. Modern thinking is it probably stood with its legs together, not straddling the harbor like you often see in pictures. The straddling pose is probably wrong then. Most likely, yeah. Too unstable. Apparently, the engineers for the Statue of Liberty actually studied the Colossus's failure to help design her internal structure better. Wow, learning from ancient mistakes. So how long did this incredible statue actually stand?
Sadly, not very long at all. Only about 54 years.
54 years. That's it. What happened?
Another big earthquake in 226 BCE. Snapped it off at the knees. It just collapsed.
Oh, man. What happened to the pieces?
Well, the huge broken chunks just lay there near the harbor for almost 800 years.
800 years. Just lying there.
Yep. Apparently, the Rhodians thought about rebuilding it, but an oracle warned them it would bring bad luck, so they left it. The pieces became a famous tourist site in their own right. People wrote about how amazing the fragments were, like one finger was bigger than a man.
Imagine seeing ruins on that scale. How did it finally disappear?
After those 800 years, Rhodes was conquered by Arabs. They didn't see it as a wonder, they saw it as scrap metal, valuable bronze. So they broke it up further, melted it all down, probably sold it off, likely made into tools, weapons, coins. Gone.
Melted down for scrap. What
Oh.
an end. Okay, last one. The youngest wonder. The Lighthouse of Alexandria.
Right, on the island of Pharos in the harbor of Alexandria, Egypt, built around 2,300 years ago, closest to Philo's time.
And this one's often called the first skyscraper, right?
Pretty much. Its height was incredible for the ancient world. Estimates average around 130 meters. That's only a bit shorter than the Great Pyramid itself, making it the third tallest structure on Earth at the time, maybe 40 stories high.
40 stories. And it was a functional lighthouse. The sources mention some wild claims about his light beam.
They do, and this is probably the most debated aspect. Ancient writers claimed you could see its light from 50 miles away at sea.
50 miles? How is that even possible back then?
Exactly. The sources use some modern examples to show how extreme that sounds, like seeing it from across entire prefectures in Japan or huge municipalities in China. It just seems physically impossible with an ancient light source.
So what was the light source? No electricity, obviously.
Right, that's the big operational mystery. It was a massive bonfire burning constantly up on the top platform. The light was reflected out by a huge curved mirror made of polished bronze.
A giant bonfire.
Yeah.
But didn't Egypt lack wood? Especially around Alexandria.
Precisely. That's the core problem the sources highlight. Where did they get enough fuel to keep a huge fire burning every single night for, well, it stood for 1,500 years?
1,500 years of fuel needed. What could they have used, and how did they get it 40 stories up?
That's the puzzle. What fuel? And the logistics. The main theory mentioned in your sources involves a spiral ramp or staircase inside the tower. And get this. Donkeys were supposedly used to haul the fuel up continuously.
Donkeys, climbing a 40-story spiral ramp, day in, day out, carrying fuel for centuries.
That's the picture the sources paint. It sounds exhausting, almost comical, but it highlights the incredible, relentless effort needed to keep that light burning using only ancient technology, a real logistical feat, if true.
Wow, just picturing that is amazing. So its main job was guiding ships.
Absolutely. Alexandria's harbor was tricky, shallow in parts, with dangerous reefs around Pharos Island. The lighthouse was essential for safe navigation, guiding ships in, warning them of dangers. It had to be lit every night.
And how long did this ancient skyscraper last?
It did incredibly well, stood for about 1,500 years, second only to the Great Pyramid in longevity among the wonders.
What finally brought it down, let me guess, earthquake.
You got it. Two major earthquakes in the 14th century, 1303 and 1323, finally did it in.
Are there any remains today?
Yes. The lowest part, the base, actually survived and was later incorporated into the foundations of the citadel of Kitbe, a fortress you can still see there, and lots of huge stone blocks from the upper parts fell into the sea. Divers have found them underwater, confirming the lighthouse's massive scale. And like the mausoleum, the sources again point to that Masonic memorial in D.C., suggesting it also took inspiration from the lighthouse's tiered design.
Okay, so that's the rundown of the 6 wonders besides the pyramid, based on your sources. What a journey.
It really is, and you see the patterns, right? Incredible ambition, mind-bending engineering challenges.
And unfortunately, a lot of destruction, fire, earthquakes, conquests, even that weird arsonist guy.
Exactly. And very few physical traces left for some, while for others we have this amazing archaeological proof popping up in unexpected places, workshops, underwater ruins.
It's fascinating how much we can piece together, even with so much lost. Looking back at all of them, what are the big takeaways or the enduring mysteries the sources leave us with?
Well, beyond the specific puzzles for each wonder, like a Babylonian water pumps or Phidias's ivory trick or the lighthouse fuel,
Right.
the sources point to a kind of deeper mystery, maybe about the mindset of the builders themselves. Let's call it the confidence paradox.
The confidence paradox. What do you mean?
Think about it. How did these ancient designers and engineers dare to even attempt these things? These were huge, complex, often unprecedented structures. They didn't have computer models or modern stress calculations or even clear examples to copy for some of them.
Yeah, they were really pushing the envelope.
Massively. They poured incredible amounts of money, resources, manpower, sometimes over decades, into projects that, from our perspective, look insanely risky. Why weren't they constantly collapsing during construction? How did so many last for centuries, even millennia, before disasters hit?
That's a really good point. We simulate everything today. They just built it and seemed pretty sure it would work.
It implies a level of practical knowledge, or maybe just sheer audacity and confidence that's hard for us to fully wrap our heads around. And that brings us right back to the ultimate example, the Great Pyramid of Giza.
The oldest, the survivor, the one we haven't focused on as much today.
Exactly, because the sources make this crucial comparison. Remember, the Great Pyramid is roughly 2,000 years older than most of these other wonders.
2,000 years.
Yet it's described as arguably the most precise, large stone structure ever built, ancient or modern. The accuracy of its alignment to true north, the levelness of its base, the fit of the stones, the margin of error is almost negligible, even after 4,500 years.
I remember the source mentioning something about rolling a ball on its base.
Yeah, the analogy was that its base is so perfectly flat and level. A smooth ball placed anywhere on it probably wouldn't roll. Try doing that on the foundation of most modern buildings.
That kind of precision achieved so long ago, it's just staggering.
It really is. And this leads to the source's final kind of provocative thought on the whole list. Compared to the sheer age and that almost impossible precision of the Great Pyramid, the other 6 wonders, well, as magnificent as they were,
They pale a bit in comparison.
that's the phrasing used, they pale in comparison or live in its shadow. Not to diminish them, they were incredible feats. But the pyramid is just on another level of ancient mystery and achievement. So the sources suggest maybe we should think of the lists like Philo originally did Great Things to See, or maybe even as 1 plus 6?
The pyramid and then the other 6, amazing but different achievements.
Something like that.
Wow. This deep dive has definitely given me a whole new appreciation for these wonders, beyond just the names. We've covered the stories, the mysteries, even some of those funny or strange details from your sources.
Yeah, it really highlights that even with all we know, or think we know, there are still huge questions about what ancient people were truly capable of, their knowledge, their sheer nerve.
So here's a final thought for you, listening at home, based on everything we've discussed. When you think about lost techniques, like how Phidias worked that ivory, or the precision of the pyramid built without tools we think are essential, what other knowledge might have vanished from the ancient world? What could they do back then that we can't even understand, let alone replicate today?
What does it suggest about human potential? Or maybe how knowledge rises and falls over time?
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you.
We'll catch you on the next one.